Hi, I'm Janelle, also Seams Come True, and I'm going to take you on a walkthrough of how I made my pullover based on Appa from Avatar the Last Airbender. After looking at Shannon Fabric's website, I knew I had made the right choice because of their gorgeous Luxe cuddle faux fur line. I'm excited to show you guys how I did this, so let's get to it. This is the design I initially sent to Shannon Fabrics. I wanted to go for a classic sporty look, which fit perfectly with the belly. I also designed some three-toed mittens, but those will be part of another tutorial. Their experts helped me decide which fabrics would work best, and then they shipped them over super fast. For this project, I used my favorite oversized sweater to make the pattern. Other key materials include Kraft paper, fabric scissors, pencil, thread cutters, my rotary cutters, 1/2-inch elastic, good quality thread, a zipper that matches your material colors. If you are unsure of the length of zipper you will need, you can always trim it down later. The appropriate needle types for your fabrics, I use universal for satin and ballpoint for fur. And finally, fabric weights. These will come in handy when cutting your slippery satin. I sewed everything with my Janome Memorycraft 9450 and Airthread 2000D Serger. I started by tracing the main body of the sweatshirt onto the Kraft paper. To do this, I made sure everything was laying nice and flat, and I folded it in half down the front center. Once I made sure all the points were lined up, I very carefully took my pencil, being sure not to push the fabric, and traced the whole outside edge. I also made notations indicating where the neckline, armhole, and waistband sat. The neckline and arm sides can be a little tricky, but if you hold the fabric in place and flip the excess material over, you can get pretty close to where the seam line should lay. I then cleaned up all my lines with my straight ruler and styling design ruler. This tool is incredibly handy when trying to smooth out curves. Next, I marked where the neckline for the back piece lays, otherwise the front and back pieces are exactly the same. I once again used my styling ruler to smooth out this curved line. I traced my sleeve in exactly the same way, laid everything nice and flat, and then traced all the outside edges, including the sleeve seam line. To get the shoulder seam line, I did the same pinch and flip method, trying to get everything as exact as possible, and then I used my ruler to smooth out all the lines. I then added all my seam allowances and cut both pattern pieces out with my rotary blade. Don't worry, I have separate blades for fabric and paper. Because I only traced half the bodice pattern, I folded the paper in half and cut out the whole pattern piece. Next up, I used that back bodice piece to create the front, dividing the chest into 2 pieces to accommodate the zipper and also indicating where I wanted the belly piece to meet the chest. I did this by measuring from my neck to where I wanted the top of the belly piece to start and making a mark. I then drew a line at that mark to separate the chest from the belly piece. Here I am using my tracing wheel to separate those pattern pieces onto their own pieces of paper. I added seam allowances and those base shapes were done. Next up, I added the stripes to the belly pattern by dividing the front center measurement by 6. There's definitely some wiggle room on design here, so just add however many stripes looks good on your pattern. I cut out both pattern pieces with my rotary cutter, folding the belly portion on the center front line, and cutting to form one whole pattern. I used my handy dandy tracing wheel to transfer the belly stripe markings onto the other half of the pattern and then extended the lines all the way over. The final portion of the original sweater that we have to trace is the hood. Once again, we're going to lay it flat, making sure all the points line up, and then very carefully trace the whole outside edge, indicating the seam marks at the shoulders, and then using the pinch and flip method to get the neckline seam. and then you guessed it, I cleaned up the seams with my rulers, added my seam allowances, and then cut out the whole shape. As you can see here, the original hood fits a little snugly around my head, so I'm going to extend the length and give it a slightly slouchier and cuter look. To do this, I use the slash and spread method. This is where you take a pattern piece, slash it across the length that you want to extend, and then spread the two pieces onto a new sheet of paper and trace the new shape. While extending the length of the hood, I also decide to extend the zipper up into it. I'm going to do this by extending the front of the hood out slightly, as illustrated by this little doodle. I measured out about 3 inches, drew a curve to connect it, and then connect the front tip to the bottom with a straight line. I knew some testing would be necessary, so I went ahead and added seam allowances and cut it out. I made my first mock-up out of muslin. Even though it won't act exactly as the fur will, it's a good test to see how all the pattern pieces are working together and if the lining will fit properly. After cutting out all my pieces, marking seam allowances, and adding the stripes to the belly, it was time to assemble. I began assembly by pinning together the 2 top front chest pieces where the zipper would go. These were then attached to the belly portion and put aside. The hood was pinned along the back edge, and the front and back bodice pieces were pinned together at the shoulders and sewn. All of these pins were then sewn with a straight basting stitch on my machine. The sleeves were attached at the shoulders first, and this was done by lining up the top center points, the end points, and keeping everything nice and even. Once the sleeves were attached, I pinned and sewed shut the side seam and underarm seam. It is important to clip your curves before turning your garment right side out, or else those areas will pull and distort your fabric. The hood was attached by lining up the back center and front edges. It was pinned and sewn with that same straight basting stitch. After turning everything right side out, I popped it onto my mannequin. I started sketching on the iconic markings onto the back. It's okay if it wasn't perfect at this point because everything would be measured and placed nicely on the final pattern. The center back stripe was then extended up onto the hood and forward to figure out where I wanted the arrow to end. Once the hood was on the mannequin, I realized that the top front edge extended slightly too far forward for my taste. So I went ahead and pinned and marked the new front edge and then sketched on the arrow. At this point, I disassembled everything with my X-Acto blade. Yes, I should have used a seam ripper, but I'm a little impatient. I marked the arrow onto my paper pattern piece and then proceeded to make the adjustments to the front edge of the hood like I wanted. I did this via the slash and pinch method where I slashed and then squeezed down the hood to the shape I wanted it to be. The next step was to transfer the sketches of the back stripes onto the pattern piece. I did this by taking measurements of the sketches and placing them in the appropriate places on the back. I then made myself a little template to make it faster to transfer each individual stripe without having to measure them individually. Speaking of stripes, let's go over 2 different techniques to creating this type of color change in fur. The first method is an applique technique, where you leave the bodice as one large piece of fabric and you cut out your brown stripe, place it onto the fabric, and then zigzag stitch down the edges. It is faster but a less clean finish, and you end up getting sort of a gaping effect if the fabric is bent too far backward or flipped upside down. The second method is a piecing technique where you cut out the design from the bodice piece and then sew the brown markings into the seams themselves. This is the method that I used. The fur ends up being more blended and looks like it is all growing out of the same base. It takes way more time, like a lot more time, but I think the results are worth it. This all plays into how I constructed the hood pattern. You can see here that the hood has the arrow drawn onto it, but I decided to piece together my white and brown fabric. So you can see the arrow piece here, and then the white piece here. In my final version, the arrow is one solid piece, so ignore it in 2 different pieces here. For the belly, instead of having to cut out individual stripes, I'm just going to pinch and sew the back to create a piecing effect. This will also help it lay flatter and smoother by reducing bulk on the inside of the garment. Each of these pinches will consume about ½ an inch of fabric, so I multiplied that by 6 and added it to the length of the pattern piece. Here I am cutting out all the pieces for the lining, which I find really helpful to make first to make sure everything fits properly. It's much easier to recut and sew the lining than it is to recut and sew all the fur. These pieces are assembled in the same order as the mock-up: shoulders, sleeves, then sides. The lining is sewn with a standard straight stitch, and then I go over all my seams and raw edges with my serger to prevent thread pulls and fraying. Who doesn't love a good serger time lapse? And then, as you should, I pressed everything nice and flat. Sorry for all the elbow. This line represents where the zipper will be. When it comes time to finish the lining, I will cut along this line and hand whip stitch the lining to the edge of the zipper, but for now I will leave it intact. Here I am attaching the sleeves to the bodice portion, just like we did on the muslin. Lining up the top center portions and the edges keeps everything nice and even. Test flaps are very important. Next up is the underarm and side seam. The front and back are a little mismatched at the bottom because I forgot to remove the excess we added to the belly portion for the stripes. It's okay, it's better than being too short. I didn't film the final test of the lining, but everything fit great, so it was then time to cut out the fur. Cutting faux fur is an art form all its own. You have to make sure the fur is going in the correct direction, as well as make sure that all your seam lines are very clearly marked, because as you sew with faux fur, it likes to shift and stretch and move around. I cut out the pieces, cutting through only the backing with my X-Acto blade. This causes far less hair shedding and prevents hair from being cut that will be visible at cuffs and hems. Yes, this is time consuming, but it prevents future issues that will add to your overall time even more. The back stripes were cut out as one solid piece with all seam allowances clearly marked. The stencil I made earlier came in handy again here. Please also pretend that the arrow is one solid piece. This was a change that was made right before the final version. Next, I traced the pattern piece for the belly and added all the markings for the stripes. This was the final fur piece to be cut out, so it's time to assemble. When sewing with faux fur, I prefer to use sewing clips over pins. Also, some people like to take a shaver and shave off the extra fur that goes between the seams, but I think I get just as clean a finish by pushing the fur forward into the seam and clipping it. After sewing each piece together, I like to use a wide tooth comb and brush through it. That helps disguise the seam and blend the fur. After sewing the front edge of both the inside and outside layers of the hood together, I turned everything right side out, combed through, and then serged the bottom edge that connects to the neckline. This was then hidden by the lining in the final steps. Piecing together the stripe portions to the back of the bodice was definitely the most time consuming, but I think the final effect was worth it. I first machine sewed all the center straight sections together, and then pinned and hand stitched each individual stripe together. Here are all the center straight sections sewn together, and before I could hand sew the tips in, I had to make sure to clip all the points that would cause tension. I did this with my much too dull fabric scissors. I also snipped the tips of the white fabric where the brown pieces would lay. Here you can see me hand pinning each individual stripe, which I will finish and attach with a single line of straight stitches. I did not record this process, so here is a picture of what that looked like. Now it's time for the belly. For this, I pinched the back along the markings and sewed a single line of stitches to create a seam effect without adding to the bulk of the back of the fabric. I'm a big fan of any technique that speeds up the process and leads to a nice smooth finish. Just look how pretty this is. Now that that was done, it was time to assemble the rest of the bodice. I began by attaching the 2 front chest pieces at the shoulders to the back piece. I clipped, sewed, and then serged the edge to contain all the loose fur. The assembled hood is attached to the neckline at this point. We are adding it now because we are also extending the zipper up into the hood via that little extension we added. I did not finish the seam with serging because the lining was going to conveniently hide it. Next up, I started attaching the zipper by lining it up with the top front edge of the hood and pinning all the way down. I then base stitched it in place and repeated for the other side. Once I was happy with the placement, I took it through my machine and gave it a good strong straight stitch. I attached the belly to the chest portion by clipping it, trimming off the excess zipper, doing a straight stitch, and then finishing it with my serger. To avoid the zipper being caught in the fur, I used my comb to brush the fur towards the zipper and trim off anything that intersected with it. I think next time I'll use clippers though. Before I attached the sleeves, I made the elastic casings for the wrists. I did this by measuring the length of the sleeve opening, which already includes the seam allowance. And then because I'm using 1/2 inch elastic, I made that strip 1.5 inches wide. I cut 2 pieces out of satin and 2 pieces out of regular cotton to add some structure. I laid a satin strip with the good side facing up on top of a cotton strip and folded them. When sewing the seam, I left a 1/2 inch gap on 1/2 so that when these are attached to the sleeve, there will be a convenient opening to slide the elastic to. You can see that opening here. To make the waistband, I do the same measurement and multiply it by 2. I cut the strips out of both satin and cotton again and use the same technique to create the elastic access point. For the waistband, because it is larger, I used pins to mark the halfway point to make it attaching to the waist easier. Once completed, I set both the wrist and waist elastic casings aside. To attach the sleeves, I did exactly what I did for the mock-up and the lining, where I clipped both pieces together, sewed, and then serged them. For the underarm and side seam, I lined up all the connection points, pushed the fur inside, and clipped it. I used a straight stitch and serged the edge. This reduces bulk and keeps everything nice and tidy. I really hope that you guys don't mind all the time lapses because when I watch tutorials, I find them really helpful. If it is too much, please comment and let me know. It's helpful to know what works and what doesn't for you guys. We are in the final stretch. The bodice is essentially done now, and it is time to flip it right side out and attach the elastic casings to the wrist and bottom edges. I folded the circles so that the satin was on the outside and made note of where the elastic opening was. It should be facing out so that when I attach the circle to the sleeve and then it is folded into position, the elastic access point will be on the inside. I pinned it in place with the underarm seam and raw edges aligned. Then used a straight stitch and the serger to attach. Then I attached the elastic casing to the bottom. This took more pins to keep the satin from separating from the cotton. Again, keep in mind where your elastic access point is positioned. This ultimately got sandwiched between the lining layer and the outside layer, so I really didn't have to serge it, but I just think it looks nice. I then flipped my lining layer inside out and slid it over the fur layer. The bottom waistband was pinched between these two layers, sewn and serged. Next up, I flipped the lining right side out and tucked it inside of the outer shell, as it is supposed to fit. The rest of its attachment was done by hand. I pinned the lining to the neck hole to keep it in place and then turned the whole thing inside out for easier access. Once I pinned all along the neckline and sleeve openings, I used a simple whip stitch to attach it. This is where I cut my lining on that center front mark and whip stitched that split near the zipper. While I was finishing the wrists, I used a safety pin attached to my elastic and slid it through the conveniently placed openings on the elastic casings. After sewing together the ends of the elastic, I sewed the access points closed. A flying bison wouldn't be a flying bison without their adorable horns and ears, so I took the measurements of how tall I wanted the horn to be and sketched out their rough shape. They ended up being about 5 inches tall. Keeping in mind that this is not a 2D object and the fabric would have to be wider at the base to create a circle, I extended the pattern piece out slightly at the roundest point. I was able to do this freehand because I did plush toy design for 4.5 years, but making shapes like this just takes practice and experimentation. So don't be discouraged if it takes a couple mock-ups to get it right. To test my shape, I cut out the pattern piece, cut it out of cotton, sewed it up, turned and stuffed it with excess fur. Once I was happy with the shape, I used a thick cotton fabric with iron-on stabilizer on the back and more silky satin solid fabric from Shannon Fabrics on top. When making small pieces, I like to trace, pin, and then cut out the shapes before I sew. Both horns were turned and stuffed with excess fur scraps to reduce waste. They end up more solid than using polyfill, and I like that the materials can be treated the same as the rest of the body fabric. The ears were made by taking an approximate measurement and creating a spoon shape that will be folded over to create a lopsided cone. Again, it is very important to make sure your fur is facing the correct direction before cutting out your pieces. Each ear also has satin lining and was cut out using the same pattern. I clipped and sewed each piece together while tucking in the fur and leaving an opening to turn through. All that was left was to turn them right side out, sew together the straight edges, and attach to the hood. These were just pinned on, and then I used a whip stitch and a lot of trust to not stab myself while attaching them to the hood. When sewing things to faux fur, you really can't see the actual base material itself, so you have to rely on touch. Definitely helps to have some finger calluses. Now that these are attached, it's time for the big reveal. I had so much fun making this project, and I hope this walkthrough was helpful and gave you some tips and tricks on how to take on your own character-themed pullover project. Thank you again to Shannon Fabrics for providing the beautiful fabrics I used on this project. If you have any questions or comments or anything, comment below. I'll be checking this video regularly. You're also welcome to contact me on Instagram at SeamsComeTrue, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Remember, learning is not failure. I hope you have a wonderful day, and thank you again so much for watching.